The Blackwood Hotel, Manhattan. December. The snow had been falling since noon. By 7 in the evening, Fifth Avenue had gone quiet in a way that only a true New York blizzard could manage, the kind of silence that swallowed taxicabs and turned the whole glittering city into a landscape painting no one had asked for. Inside the Blackwood Grand Hotel, however, the silence was entirely manufactured. Every lamp burned at the precise wattage that had been approved by the interior consultant. Every surface marble, chrome, glass, reflected back the cold perfection that Adrian Blackwood demanded of the spaces he owned. Adrian stood at the window of the mezzanine level, one hand in the pocket of his jacket, and watched the lobby below with the measured detachment of a man reviewing a spreadsheet. He was 38 years old, the kind of lean that comes not from vanity but from forgetting to eat during 16-hour days. His hair was dark, shot through with early gray at the temples, not from age, his doctor had said, but from cortisol. He had laughed at that in the way he laughed at most things his doctor told him. Briefly, without warmth, and without changing a single habit, the lobby staff moved below him in practiced arcs. The concierge greeted arriving guests. The bell attendants disappeared through revolving glass with luggage carts, and there, near the far end of the reception hall, a man in a white service vest moved between tables with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this work for a long time and had decided, quietly, that it was worth doing well. Adrian watched him for nearly 4 minutes before he spoke. Calloway, his head of hospitality operations, appeared at his elbow within seconds. A compact woman named Sandra Calloway, who had worked for Adrian for 11 years and had long since learned the particular economy of his attention. The server at table 14, the one in the southwest quadrant. He's been on shift since 2? Yes, sir. Daniel Hayes. He's been with us 14 months. His reviews are, send him to the mezzanine. I want a word. Sandra hesitated for exactly 1 second. She had learned the cost of more than 1 second, and then she was gone. Adrian turned back to the window. Below him, he watched as Sandra approached the man named Daniel Hayes and spoke quietly to him. Daniel Hayes set down the tray he was carrying with careful, unhurried hands. He smoothed the front of his vest. He looked up toward the mezzanine. He did not look nervous. That was, Adrian noted, the first thing that was different about him. Most of them looked nervous. The practice had begun 4 years ago, after Adrian read a business case study about pressure testing organizational culture through unannounced personnel evaluations. He had adapted the concept into something considerably more direct. He would select a member of staff, usually mid-level, usually someone who had received a quiet commendation of some kind, and he would administer what he privately thought of as the test. He would threaten termination, clearly, publicly, without prior warning, and observe the response. What he was looking for, he had told himself, was character, composure, the ability to absorb pressure without fracturing. What he was actually looking for, though he would not have framed it this way, was something he could not have named. He had been doing it long enough that the results had begun to seem like data. The data had begun to feel like certainty, and certainty, for a man who had built his entire life on the management of variables, was the closest thing to comfort he knew. Daniel Hayes arrived at the mezzanine landing with the quiet footfall of a man accustomed to not drawing attention to himself. He was perhaps 32, with the kind of face that is built for patience, square jaw, steady, dark eyes, a composure that did not seem practiced so much as simply present. His hands were the hands of a man who did physical work, slightly rough at the knuckles, clean at the nails. Adrian let the silence sit for a moment. The hotel murmured below them. Mr. Hayes, I've been reviewing the staff performance numbers for this quarter, and I've made some decisions. He paused, a long pause, the kind that was designed to be uncomfortable. Daniel Hayes met his eyes and waited. You're fired. Silence. Not the silence of a man processing shock. Not the silence of a man reaching for anger or for words. A different kind of silence, one that had weight and depth to it, like water that was too cold to move. And then Daniel Hayes said something that Adrian Blackwood had not, in 4 years of administering this particular test, ever heard. He said it quietly. His voice did not waver, but it was not steady in the way of control. It was steady in the way of someone who is holding something very carefully because they are afraid of what happens if they drop it. Sir, if this is final, I only ask one thing. Please don't tell my daughter. Adrian said nothing. The lobby hummed below them. The snow pressed against the tall glass windows, soft and relentless and indifferent. And something in Adrian Blackwood's chest, something he would not have been able to locate on a diagram, something he had stopped checking on years ago, shifted 1/4 of an inch. What one line can carry. Please don't tell my daughter. Adrian stood at the window of his private office on the 14th floor, long after Daniel Hayes had been quietly returned to his shift because Adrian had not, in the end, said anything further. He had nodded once, which Sandra Calloway had correctly interpreted as a postponement rather than a confirmation, and then he had walked away. He was aware this was an unusual outcome. He was aware that Daniel Hayes was probably not aware of how unusual it was. He poured 2 fingers of scotch and did not drink it. Please don't tell my daughter. It was not the words themselves. Adrian had heard harder things said in harder rooms. He had watched men receive diagnoses, receive verdicts, receive the kind of news that reshapes a life in a single breath. He was not, by any clinical measure, easily moved. But there was something in the specific quality of what Daniel Hayes had said that he could not set aside. It was the precision of it. Not, don't fire me. Not, I have a family to support. Not the immediate, reflexive self-preservation that Adrian had come to expect and had, somewhere along the way, begun to hold in a kind of low, quiet contempt. He had asked only that his daughter not be told, because she believed he was strong, because the most important thing in the entire situation, more important than the job, more important than the money, more important than what Adrian thought or what the hotel policy said, was that a small girl continued to believe that her father was the person she needed him to be. Adrian sat down in his desk chair, which cost more than Daniel Hayes probably earned in 2 months, and he looked at the darkened surface of his desk, and he felt something that he had not felt in a long time. He felt ashamed, not dramatically, not with any particular fanfare. Just the quiet, specific discomfort of a man who has done something and knows, with sudden clarity, that it was not good. The way you know when you have tracked mud across a clean floor, not a catastrophe, but a mark that requires attention. He picked up his phone. He sent 2 messages, one to Sandra, one to the hotel's HR director. He did not explain the messages. He rarely did. The first message said, Hayes stays. Performance review in 30 days. The second said, pull his file. I want to read it. He set the phone down. Outside, the snow continued to fall on the city that had given him everything he had ever asked of it. And he sat in his expensive chair in his expensive office and thought about a man who had asked nothing for himself and everything for someone else. It was, Adrian thought, with the particular disorientation of a man encountering a landscape he did not recognize, a strange kind of love. He had seen many kinds. He had seen the calculated kind, performed for boards and shareholders and cameras. He had seen the hollow kind, offered by people who wanted things from him. He had seen the frantic kind, the desperate kind, the transactional kind. He had not, in a long time, seen the simple kind, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen at all. What Adrian watched, and what it cost him. He told himself he was conducting due diligence. This was not entirely untrue. Adrian Blackwood's instinct, when confronted with something he didn't understand, was research. He had built a hospitality group worth $300 million on the principle that thorough information was the only reliable foundation for good decisions. When the market surprised him, he read more. When a property underperformed, he visited it personally and spoke to the staff at every level. He was not a man who tolerated the unknown. So he read the file. Daniel Hayes, age 31, from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, originally had moved to New York at 24, following a short marriage that had ended when his daughter, Lily, was 11 months old. The mother was not in the picture. The file did not elaborate on this, and Adrian did not ask. Daniel had held 3 jobs in the years since arriving in the city: a stock position at a warehouse in the Bronx, a delivery driving role in Queens, and then the hotel. He had been commended by 2 separate guests in his first 6 months. His attendance record showed no absences in 14 months. There was a note from a shift supervisor that read simply, "Reliable, thoughtful, doesn't cause problems." There was no note about the daughter. There didn't need to be. Adrian had, with a specific, deliberate curiosity he chose not to examine too closely, arranged for his driver to make 2 detours over the following week. The first took him past the public elementary school in Astoria, where he had confirmed through the hotel's HR records Lily Hayes was enrolled in the 2nd grade. He sat in the car for 17 minutes one morning and watched the drop-off. He told himself he was not sure what he was looking for. He found it anyway. A gray 10-year-old Civic pulled up at the curb. Daniel Hayes got out first and circled to the passenger side with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He opened the door. A small girl, dark-haired, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large and a backpack that seemed to weigh almost as much as she did, climbed down carefully and immediately reached for her father's hand. Daniel crouched to her level. Adrian could not hear the words from the distance, but he could read the shape of it: a brief, serious conversation, the kind parents have with children when they are not talking down to them. The girl nodded. She said something back. Daniel smiled, and it was... Adrian noticed, with an odd catch in his breath, a completely different smile than the composed, professional expression he wore at the hotel. This one reached his eyes. It changed the whole architecture of his face. He stood. He adjusted the strap of her backpack. She walked away, and he watched her go until she disappeared inside the building's double doors. He stood there for a full 30 seconds after she was gone. Then he got back in his car. Adrian looked at his own hands for a moment in the dim back seat of his town car. Then he looked out the window at the ordinary street, the slushed gutters, the bodega with its plastic-wrapped fruit on the sidewalk, the pigeons conferring on a fire escape above a dry cleaner. He did not have children. He had not, he realized, thought about this fact in several years. It was one of those facts that had simply been filed somewhere inconvenient and left. He thought about it now. He thought about what it would be to have something worth crouching down for, something that rewarded your full attention, not because it was profitable, not because it would generate returns, not because some analysis recommended it, but because it was simply, irrevocably, the most important thing in the room. He thought about the file, which had said, "Reliable, thoughtful, doesn't cause problems." And he thought about how that phrase had never once appeared in any description of himself. What a child sees that a CEO misses. It was the 3rd Thursday of December, and the city was in the particular agitated state it entered when a school snow day intersected with a business day, and neither side was willing to accommodate the other. By 10 in the morning, the Blackwood Grand's lobby contained 2 stranded conference guests. One, wet retriever belonging to a novelist in room 812, and a 7-year-old girl sitting very properly in one of the leather armchairs near the concierge desk with a library book balanced on her knees. Her name was Lily Hayes. She was here because the school had sent a robocall at 7:45. The temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, and Daniel Hayes had had no other options that did not involve leaving his daughter alone in an apartment that took 40 minutes to heat properly. Adrian became aware of her existence in the usual way he became aware of things that happened in his hotels, because something was slightly out of pattern. He had come down to speak to the events coordinator about the Christmas dinner reservation overflow, and he had noticed, on his way back through the lobby, a child who was reading without fidgeting. He stopped. In his experience, children in hotel lobbies were either bored into chaos or over-caffeinated into chaos. This one was neither. She was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has been told by someone she respects to sit still, and who has decided that the request is reasonable. He did not approach her immediately. He stood at an angle, watching. Across the lobby, Daniel Hayes was working a table of late breakfasters with the composed attentiveness he brought to everything. Every few minutes, his eyes moved to the armchair. Brief, automatic, the way you check a compass, bearing not anxiously, just to confirm position. The girl looked up from her book at one of these moments. She caught her father's eye across the lobby. She gave him a small, definitive nod, as if to say, "Still here? Still fine? Carry on." He gave her the same nod back, smaller. Then they both returned to their respective work. Adrian watched this exchange and felt, without warning, that he was intruding on something private. He sat down, not in a meaningful way. He sat in an armchair, 2 positions over from the girl, because his legs had decided to, and because he seemed to have run out of the specific fuel required for standing. Lily Hayes looked at him over the top of her book. She had her father's eyes dark and direct and unimpressed by performance. "You're the man who owns this," she said. It was not a question. Adrian looked at her. "What makes you think that?" "Because everyone keeps almost talking to you and then not. That's what people do around owners, my dad told me." Adrian considered this for a moment. "Your dad is very observant. He notices everything," Lily said, with the simple certainty of a statement that has never needed to be proven because it has never been questioned. "He says if you pay attention, you can figure out almost anything." "Does he?" "He figured out I was sad about moving schools last year just from the way I was eating my cereal. He didn't even ask. He just sat down next to me and said, 'Let's go to the park.'" She went back to her book. Adrian looked at the ceiling. After a moment, he said, "What are you reading?" She held up the cover without looking at him. It was a book about ocean animals. "Did you know," she said, still reading, "that octopuses have 3 hearts?" "I did not know that. I think that's really smart, because if one breaks, you still have 2 more. She turned a page. Adrian Blackwood, who had 3 MBAs, 2 honorary doctorates, and a net worth that required specialist accountants to manage, sat very still in his lobby chair and said nothing at all. He stayed there for 22 minutes. Later, when Daniel came to collect her for her lunch break and found his employer sitting 2 chairs away from his daughter, quietly reading the Financial Times, he stopped dead. Lily looked up. "Daddy's the strongest man in the world," she told Adrian, as though this was relevant information he might have been missing. "He carries everything. He doesn't ever drop anything." Adrian folded his newspaper. He looked at Daniel Hayes, who was standing very still with an expression that was trying to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "I believe you," Adrian said, "when the only thing that matters becomes clear." The storm that meteorologists had been gesturing at for 3 days arrived at 9:47 on a Tuesday night with the decisive manner of something that had no intention of being brief. By 10:15, it was a whiteout. Lily Hayes had fallen asleep in the staff break room on a folded uniform jacket because her father's evening babysitter arrangement had collapsed when the subway stopped running, and the backup arrangement had collapsed shortly after. Daniel had checked on her twice in the past hour. She had been fine both times, sleeping the deep, authoritative sleep of small children who trust entirely that the world will continue to manage itself while they are unconscious. At 10:42, Daniel appeared in the lobby, moving fast and quiet in the specific way of someone who is frightened and has decided that fear does not have permission to be loud. He went to Sandra Calloway. Adrian, who was crossing the lobby toward the elevator, saw the exchange from 30 feet. He saw Sandra's face change. He changed direction. "What happened?" It was not a question. Sandra looked at him with her careful professional face and said, "Lily. She's burning up. Daniel says she was fine an hour ago. Now she's—" Adrian was already moving. He did not think about what he was doing. This was unusual for him. He was a person who habitually thought about what he was doing and then thought about it again from a different angle, and then asked two people to verify his thinking. None of that happened. He walked into the staff break room and he saw Daniel Hayes kneeling on the floor beside his daughter, one hand on her forehead, one holding hers, and the girl's face was a color it was not supposed to be. Daniel looked up. His composure was present, but it was costing him something. Adrian could see it in the particular stillness around his eyes, the way a man looks when he is spending his entire reserve on appearing calm. Her fever's high. I need to get her to a hospital. But the cabs are. My car is in the basement garage, Adrian said. It's already warm. Let's go. There was a quarter second of hesitation, Daniel looking at him with an expression that was not quite gratitude yet and was not quite suspicion, just the raw assessment of someone who doesn't have time to weigh it carefully. Then he lifted his daughter in one smooth motion and said, "Okay." The drive to Lenox Hill took 14 minutes. The streets were blurred white, the headlights cutting pale wedges through falling snow. The city reduced to its bare geometry of corners and signals. Daniel sat in the back with Lily across his lap, her head against his chest, one hand pressing a cool folded cloth to her forehead. He had produced the cloth from somewhere. He was talking to her softly, not in a panicked way, in a low, steady murmur, the kind of voice designed to be a fixed point when the world is moving. Adrian sat in the front passenger seat, which he had chosen because it gave Daniel the full back seat and because he was not sure he was entitled to be closer. At one point, in the wordless middle of the drive, Lily's eyes opened partway. She looked at the ceiling of the car with the soft, unfocused gaze of someone between sleeping and waking. "Daddy," she said. "Right here," Daniel said. "I've got you." She closed her eyes again. And something in that sentence, not the words exactly, but the quality of certainty in them, the complete lack of qualification or caveat, the simple architecture of "I have you and you are safe" reached into Adrian's chest and did something that he had no prepared response for. He looked out the window at the snowed-in city and said nothing. At the hospital, he stayed. He did not plan to stay. He sat in the waiting room on a plastic chair and looked at a television that was turned to a weather channel, and he waited with a patience he had not known he possessed. 40 minutes later, Daniel appeared in the waiting room doorway. He looked not exactly relieved, but something adjacent. The way a held breath sounds when it finally releases. Fever broke. "She's asking for ginger ale." Adrian nodded. Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he sat down in the plastic chair next to him, which was one chair too close for a professional relationship and exactly the right distance for whatever this was becoming. "You didn't have to stay," Daniel said. "No," Adrian agreed. The Weather Channel showed a map of the Northeast under a blanket of white. "Thank you," Daniel said. Quietly. Without performance. Adrian looked at the map. "How long have you been doing it alone?" he asked. Daniel considered the question. 6 years, he said. "Since she was 11 months. The television showed a woman in a yellow raincoat standing in front of a wall of wind. "Is it hard?" Adrian asked. He was aware the question was inadequate. He asked it anyway. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "It's everything," he said finally. And then, "The hard part and the easy part are the same thing. She's why it's hard. She's also why none of it is actually hard." Adrian thought about this for a long time in the blue-white light of the hospital waiting room, with the snowstorm pressing against the windows and the ginger ale being fetched for a 7-year-old girl 2 corridors away. What gets built when no one was teaching you how? They talked for nearly 2 hours in that waiting room. Adrian could not, afterward, have said how it began, only that, at some point, the conversation had passed the threshold of professional, and neither of them had flagged it or stepped back. Daniel talked about Lily's first year, the apartment in the Bronx, the night shifts, the months when he had slept in 4-hour increments and learned to make a meal out of whatever was left on the counter. Not with complaint as a plain account of events, the way you describe weather that has already passed. He talked about the moment she had first said his name, which he described with a precision that told Adrian he had never stopped carrying it. Adrian listened. He was not, ordinarily, a listener. He was a questioner, precise, targeted, efficient. He extracted information and moved on. But he found that with Daniel Hayes he did not want to move on. He wanted to stay in whatever this was. At some point, Daniel asked him something that no one had asked him in a long time. "What was it like for you?" Growing up, Adrian looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Orderly," he said finally. "Very orderly." Daniel waited. Adrian told him things he had not told people who had known him for decades. Not because he had decided to, there was no decision. It came out the way things come out at 2 in the morning in hospitals and emergency rooms and other places that strip the day's performances away. His father, a man who expressed approval in the form of the absence of criticism, who had communicated love, if it was love, through the provision of school fees, ski holidays, a reliable car, and the expectation that these would be understood as sufficient, who had never once sat on the floor. His mother, talented, restless, gone before Adrian was 15, not dead, simply elsewhere, in the way of women who marry the wrong person and eventually conclude that a life unlived is more frightening than the cost of leaving. He understood this now. He had not understood it at 15. The result had been a young man who was extraordinarily good at achievement and almost entirely without practice at anything else. He had built everything he had by being better than everyone in the room at the thing that mattered in that room, and he had done it alone, which was the only way he had been taught that things were done. "And now?" Daniel asked. Adrian looked at his hands. "And now I test people," he said. The words had a different weight than he expected. "To see if they're strong, I fire them. To see how they respond." He waited for Daniel's reaction. The anger, maybe. The recognition. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "And what are you actually looking for?" he asked. Adrian opened his mouth and closed it. He did not have an answer. He had never needed an answer before, because he had never been asked by someone who would notice if the answer was false. "I don't know," he said. Daniel nodded, as if this was more useful information than a clean answer would have been. "I just want Lily to be happy," he said. Not as a lecture, not as a counter-argument, just a fact, offered without expectation. Simple, 8 words. Adrian thought of his father's study, with its glass desk and its framed degrees, and its complete absence of anything childlike or warm. He thought of the hotel lobby below his mezzanine, which he had designed to project a feeling he was not sure he had ever actually felt. He thought of Lily Hayes with her library book about octopuses and her 3-heart theory of resilience. He thought about what it would mean to have one clear thing. Just one. Simple enough to say in 8 words. When the outside world decides it has a stake, the photograph appeared on Thursday morning. It was not a good photograph technically taken at night, through a hospital window, slightly blurred by the snow on the glass. But it was clear enough. Adrian Blackwood, billionaire hotelier, sitting in a plastic chair in a public hospital waiting room beside a member of his service staff, both of them leaning slightly toward each other in the posture of people engaged in genuine conversation. It had been taken by a guest at Lenox Hill whose wife had come in for observation that same night. He had recognized Adrian because 3 years earlier, Adrian's photograph had been on the cover of a business magazine under the headline, "The Last Real Titan." He had posted it with a 3-sentence caption and woken up to 40,000 interactions. By noon, 2 major outlets had run pieces. By 3 in the afternoon, Adrian's communications director, a steady, pragmatic woman named Helen Marsh, was in his office with a yellow legal pad and an expression that mixed professionalism with something that might have been genuine concern. "The board isn't happy," she said, not with preamble. Helen had learned that Adrian preferred directness above almost everything. "I know," Adrian said. "They want a statement. They want you to confirm that this was a PR initiative, a philanthropic gesture with a staff member. Something clean. And if I don't?" Helen set down her legal pad. "Then they'll characterize it however benefits them. And it won't benefit Daniel Hayes. Adrian looked at the window. 14 floors below, the city had begun the slow process of recovering from the blizzard plows grinding along avenues, pedestrians navigating the narrowed sidewalks, the patient grinding work of a place that gets knocked over and gets up again because there is no other option. "What do they want from him?" Adrian asked. "Nothing, formally. But if you confirm this was a calculated move, then he's an asset. Useful. Protected by association." She paused. "If you don't confirm it, then he's a liability. A story. And stories tend to follow people." Adrian said nothing for a long time. Helen, who had worked for him for 6 years and had never seen him be anything other than certain, waited with an expression she was careful to keep neutral. "What would you do?" he asked. She was surprised. She took a moment. "I'd figure out which version of this I could live with," she said. "And I'd do that one." Adrian picked up his phone. He put it down again. The board had spent considerable time over the years expressing their confidence in him, which had always meant their confidence in his ability to make the numbers move in the right direction. He understood that this confidence was conditional, and that the condition was never explicitly stated because it never needed to be. He had always been willing to satisfy the condition. He had always chosen, when the calculation was in front of him, the clean option. He thought about what clean actually meant. He thought about a man who had been threatened with losing his livelihood and had asked only that his daughter not be told. He thought about what it meant to protect something at a cost to yourself, not because you'd calculated the return, but because you couldn't look yourself in the face if you didn't. He called the board chair. He told her he would issue a statement on Friday. He did not tell her what it would say. The cost of the safe answer. On Friday morning, he made the wrong decision. He knew it was wrong before he made it. He made it anyway, which is the particular cruelty of certain kinds of wrongness. It doesn't ambush you. It simply sits there in plain sight and waits for you to choose it. And you do, because the alternative requires something you are not yet sure you possess. The statement that Helen issued on his behalf confirmed that the photograph had been taken during an emergency situation involving a staff member's child, which was true, and that Mr. Blackwood had responded in his capacity as an employer committed to employee welfare, which was technically true, and that the Blackwood Group was proud of its record of supporting working families across its portfolio, which was the kind of sentence that exists to make a true thing into a smaller, more manageable thing. Daniel read it on his phone during his break, standing in the alley behind the hotel where the staff took their cigarette pauses. He did not smoke. He was simply standing outside because the air was clear and the noise of the lobby was not. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and stood for a moment in the narrow geometry of the alley brick walls. A dumpster, a fire escape, a rectangle of pale winter sky, and he breathed out slowly. He was not surprised. That was perhaps the worst part of it. He thought that he was not surprised. He had lived long enough in the particular economy of this world to know that when things are reduced to statements, the statement serves the person who issues it and not the person who features in it. He had spent 6 years building a life on the understanding that no one was going to arrange things for his convenience, and he had made his peace with that, and the peace was real. But he had spent the last 2 weeks believing, quietly and without much fanfare, that Adrian Blackwood might be different. That had been his mistake. He went back inside. He finished his shift with the composed attentiveness he brought to everything. He collected Lily from the school bus pickup. He made pasta for dinner. He read to her a book about a small bear who builds a house in the woods, and she fell asleep with her ear against his shoulder and her hand curled around his. He sat in the quiet of the apartment for a long time after. He thought about 3 hearts. He thought about how, when one breaks, you still have 2 more. He thought about the man in the hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. who had asked what it was like to grow up and had looked, briefly, like someone who had only just understood that he was allowed to miss something. He thought that it was a terrible shame. And then he put the thought somewhere it would not disturb Lily's sleep, and he went to bed. 3 miles away, Adrian Blackwood sat at his desk in a hotel office that cost more per square foot than Daniel's apartment cost per month. And he looked at the statement on his screen, and he felt the specific and unambiguous weight of a person who has chosen the wrong thing and cannot pretend otherwise. He had managed that weight before. It had never been this particular shape. What it cost to say I was wrong. He went on a Sunday. He had his driver take him as far as the bridge, and then he walked the rest of the way, because he had decided, with the particular logic of a man organizing an act of contrition, that arriving by car would be the wrong register. It was not a calculated decision so much as an instinctive one, the first purely instinctive thing he had done in a long time. Possibly. The neighborhood was the kind of Queens block that had resisted the attention of the city's renovation cycle. Brick apartment buildings with reliable bones and worn faces, a bodega on the corner that had been there since the 1980s. A laundromat, a barber shop, a Dominican restaurant from which the smell of sofrito reached the sidewalk. It was not picturesque, and it was not grim. It was simply inhabited, in the full and genuine sense. The building where Daniel lived was on the 3rd floor. Adrian found this out from Sandra Calloway, who had given him the address with an expression that said several things simultaneously and none of them out loud. He knocked. There was a pause. Then footsteps, 2 sets, actually, one heavier and one quicker, and then the door opened and Daniel Hayes stood in the doorway in a gray sweater and jeans. And behind him, peering around his arm with the specific curiosity of someone who has been waiting to see what the knock was about, was Lily. The 3 of them looked at each other. Lily said, "Oh, it's the owner." Daniel said nothing. His expression was the controlled, waiting expression of someone who has decided to hear what is being said before deciding what to do with it. Adrian looked at him directly. "I came to tell you that what I put in the statement was not adequate," he said, "and that I made it because I was afraid of the board, which is not a reason that excuses anything." Silence. Lily looked at her father. Daniel kept his eyes on Adrian. "That night at the hospital," Adrian continued, "I was there because I wanted to be there, not as a calculation, not as a gesture, because somewhere in the preceding 2 weeks you had become—" He stopped. He had not rehearsed this part because he had not known what the honest word was until he arrived. "You had become someone I didn't want to see hurt, and what I put in that statement reduced that to a policy initiative, and that was wrong. And I'm sorry." The hallway smelled of coffee and something that might have been the Dominican restaurant from the corner. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped back from the door, just slightly, the gesture of a man making room. "Do you want coffee?" he said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was a door opened a precise and deliberate amount enough to enter, not enough to pretend the last week had not occurred. Adrian understood the terms exactly. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." He went in. The apartment was small, as he had expected, and it was cold, which surprised him for a moment before he realized the windows were cracked because Lily had said she liked sleeping with air. It was not furnished expensively or trendily, but it was ordered, and there was evidence everywhere of care, a child's drawings taped at the right height, a shelf of books organized by size, a kitchen that was clean, not because anyone was coming, but because that was how Daniel Hayes chose to live. He sat at the kitchen table. Lily brought him a glass of water before the coffee was ready, with the formal hospitality of someone who has been taught to offer what she has. "Daddy says sorry is a beginning, not an end," she informed him. She said it without accusation, as a transmission of useful information. Adrian looked at Daniel, who was filling the coffee maker with his back to the room. "Your dad is right," Adrian said. They sat at that small kitchen table while the coffee brewed and the winter sun came through the cracked window, and Lily drew a picture of an octopus with 3 hearts, one for each of them, because she was 7 and because that seemed to her like the correct thing to draw. Adrian watched her work and felt something he did not have a precise word for, not happiness exactly, but its architecture. The structure that happiness gets built inside. A sense that the room he was sitting in was real in a way that most of the rooms he occupied were not. Before he left, he set a card on the table. "There's a position," he said to Daniel. "Operations manager for the hospitality division. I want someone who knows what the work actually is. It's yours if you want it." He paused. "There's no pressure, and if the answer is no, you still have your job and I'll stay out of your way." Daniel looked at the card. "I'll think about it," he said, which was the right answer. Which was the only answer that would have meant it was real. What comes after the snow? The press conference was not something Adrian had been required to hold. He had been required, by the board and by Helen and by the basic contractual requirements of leading a public-facing organization, to issue a clarifying statement. He could have done this in 3 sentences and a byline. He had, in fact, been sent a version of such a statement by his communications team, which was well-crafted and entirely bloodless, and would have resolved the news cycle in approximately 48 hours. He did not use it. He called Helen instead and told her to arrange a Thursday morning briefing, not a full press conference, but a prepared statement with questions, in the hotel's ground-floor meeting room, which had good natural light and no backdrop with the company logo. Helen had listened to this description and said, "Are you sure?" He wrote the statement himself. It took 4 drafts and 2 days, which was unusual for a man who had delivered keynote addresses to audiences of 3,000 without notes. The difficulty was not finding words that were impressive. The difficulty was finding words that were true. On Thursday morning, he stood at a podium in front of 11 journalists and 2 cameras, and he read his statement. He said that 2 weeks ago he had threatened to fire an employee for the purpose of testing his character, which was something he had done 17 times in 4 years, and which he now considered a practice built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what strength looks like. He said that the employee in question had responded not with anger or with pleading, but with a concern for his daughter's perception of him, which had taught Adrian more about genuine resilience than any metric he had ever designed. He said that he had subsequently issued a statement that reduced a genuine human experience to a corporate narrative, and that this had been a failure of honesty and a failure of respect, and that he was naming it as such because naming it was the least he could do. He said the Blackwood Group would be instituting a new employee, family support program, emergency child care provision, flexible scheduling, transparent performance review processes, not as a PR initiative, but as a correction. Because, he said, organizations that ask people to be their best selves at work without acknowledging that those same people have children who get fevers in blizzards are asking something unreasonable, and he had been asking it for a long time without noticing. He took questions for 12 minutes. Most of them were what he had expected. One journalist, young, from a business outlet, asked, "What changed for you?" "What specifically changed your mind?" Adrian thought about this. "A sentence," he said. Someone said one sentence that was not about themselves, and it didn't fit into any category I had. I spent 3 weeks trying to put it somewhere. Eventually, I stopped trying. The journalist looked at her notebook. "And the employee? Where is he now?" Adrian paused. The room was very quiet. "He starts as operations manager on the 1st of the year," Adrian said. "He's better at this than I am." There was a moment of silence, and then a sound in the room that was not quite applause and not quite laughter, but something that sat between the two and was warmer than either. 3 weeks later, on the last Saturday before Christmas, Adrian drove himself to Queens, no driver, a rental car, a box from the bakery near the hotel that Lily had once told him was her favorite because of the windows, and he knocked on a door on the 3rd floor of a brick building on a block that smelled of sofrito and possibility. Daniel opened it. He looked at the box. He looked at Adrian. "She's going to eat all of that before dinner," he said. "I know," Adrian said. Daniel stepped back from the door all the way this time. "Come in, then," he said. And Adrian Blackwood, who owned 14 properties in 6 cities and had never once known where to put his hands in a room that was not his, walked through the door of that small apartment and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he was somewhere he was supposed to be. Later, after the pastries had been mostly demolished and Lily had drawn a map of the ocean floor that she insisted on explaining in detail, the three of them went up to the building's roof. It was a flat tar roof with a low parapet and a water tower and a view of the city that was not the view from any of Adrian's penthouse suites but was, in its own way, complete. The sky was the flat, pale gray of a city that has finished snowing and is waiting to decide what comes next. There was no wind. The air was cold and clean. Lily stood at the parapet between the two of them and looked out at the landscape of rooftops and water towers and the occasional gleam of the river in the distance, and she reached out without looking and took a hand on each side. Not for balance, not from fear, simply because she was there, and they were there, and it seemed to her like the natural arrangement of things. She said, "You can see everything from up here." Neither of the men spoke for a moment. Then Daniel said, "Yeah, you can." And Adrian Blackwood stood on a rooftop in Queens in the last light of a December afternoon with a small girl holding his hand, and he thought about sentences, the weight they carry, the distance they can travel, the doors they can open in a person who had decided, without realizing it, that all his doors were already open. He thought about three hearts, and he was quiet for a long time. In the good way, the city spread out below them, patient and improbable and lit from within, and the snow, if it came again, would come for all of them equally.